He was an Undersecretary of State in the run-up to the Iraq War. Then he was named U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, an appointment so controversial the president had to sneak it in without Senate confirmation. He says the Bush administration is soft on North Korea, that the U.S. should support an Israeli airstrike on Iran, and he's still waiting for evidence of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. No figure quite epitomizes the era drawing to a close in Washington like the tough-talking John Bolton. And he's my guest on this edition of Inside USA.
So where is John Bolton these days? He resigned from his position at the UN in December 2006, when it became clear that once again, the US Senate would not grant him confirmation. But he's still walking the real corridors of power in the US Capitol. He's counsel to one of the largest law firms in the world and connected to a myriad of conservative think tanks. We tracked him down at one of them, the American Enterprise Institute.
John Bolton, welcome to Inside USA.
Glad to be here.
Let's start by talking about the presidential candidates. You've endorsed John McCain. The spin from the Democrats is that he's just more of the same, that he's a Bush clone. Do you, as a loyal Bushist...
As a Bush clone myself.
Thanks for going there. Do you agree?
No, and I don't think the American people are going to agree. Obviously, at bottom, McCain is fundamentally a conservative Republican. His voting record over years in Congress shows that, but he's also established a reputation over many years as being a maverick. That has caused him some difficulty within the Republican Party. But I think it also identifies him for the American people as somebody very different from George Bush.
What you have been arguing recently is that, in your opinion, he's better than Bush on being tough with Iran, North Korea, etc. You think America really wants tougher than Bush?
I think America doesn't want Iran with nuclear weapons and doesn't want North Korea with nuclear weapons. And they want a candidate who sees realistically what the threats are that confront America. You know, ironically, a year ago, people thought, among other reasons McCain's campaign was finished, was that he had supported the Bush policy on the surge in Iraq. And yet today, the surge is succeeding to the point where Senator Obama has gone nearly incoherent on what his policy on Iraq is. So I think in a way...
Now you've proven yourself a McCain clone, not a Bush clone.
I do the best I can.
That was early.
Because the American people, over time, favor candidates who they think are speaking honestly. They don't necessarily agree with everything a candidate says, but they look at somebody on television and they say, that person is speaking honestly, and that's a plus in American politics.
There's been a lot of honest talk from George Bush over the last 8 years, and it has brought him to the lowest popularity levels of American presidential polling history. You wrote a scathing critique of Barack Obama's recent speech in Berlin, focusing on a couple of his cliches, like when he said there's no challenge too great for a world that stands as one, and when he talked about the need to tear down walls between races, religions, rich and poor. You called this speech, which was filled with platitudes, as you pointed out, truly radical. Apart from your own partisan interest, why would you say that?
I think in a sense this speech was post-nationalist in a way that delighted the Europeans, who are doing the best to forget their own problems with nationalism during the last century. But I think it will not resonate with Americans, who remain very patriotic and very nationalistic. If perhaps Senator Obama someday wants to be president of the European Union, I'm sure that kind of rhetoric will do him just fine over there. But I think this is going to backfire on him in the American political context.
So you think it's just Europeans that are hungry for a less aggressive American foreign policy?
I don't think we've had an aggressive American foreign policy. I don't think American foreign policy in the past 50 years has been aggressive. It's been
now you're nobody's clone. That's a virtually unique view.
It's been essentially defensive and has taken steps only when there was no alternative but the use of force in order to protect the interest of the United States and our friends and allies.
Preemptive force recast now as defensive.
Well, I think if you don't believe that nuclear weapons in the hands of rogue states or terrorists don't fundamentally change the calculus, then I think you don't see the acute threat that these weapons pose. Now, this has been underway for some time. It was actually John Kennedy who first publicly said that the capability of the Soviet Union to launch nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles at the United States that required a presidential decision in minutes whether to retaliate had fundamentally changed the president's role. And I think that continues as more and more states seek and get their hands on nuclear weapons.
You've been very vocal as the tide of public opinion and clearly tides within the administration and the military establishment have turned against preemptive military action against Iran over their nuclear program. You have been standing strong and calling for regime change as the first option. Have you not learned anything from the blowback from the Iraq War to still be talking about regime change?
Well, I don't agree with your formulation of where public opinion is, number one. Number two, I'm not running for anything. So my judgments are not based on public opinion. My judgments are based on my analysis. My first major political campaign as a 15-year-old boy was to support Barry Goldwater. And even after the worst defeat in American political history, I remained a conservative. So my judgment's not affected by public opinion, except to the extent that I recognize it can limit American options in the world. And I would say that what we learned from the overthrow of Saddam Hussein is in two parts. Part one, that it was the right thing to do to overthrow Saddam because of the threat he represented. And part two, that the aftermath was obviously not well handled. The lesson in the second part does not negate the lesson of the first part.
But you're just in denial about blowback? You don't think that the whole disaster with the consequence for millions of lives in the region and here was a result of the initial invasion and occupation?
Let me just tell you, I've spoken to general citizens, business people, politicians, a whole range of people in the Arab world about what happened in Iraq, and the U.S. receives a lot of criticism. So I've asked every one of them, should we withdraw immediately? And I've yet to hear anybody except the most radical say that's what we should do.
Have you heard anyone say that life was actually better before hundreds of thousands of people died, before civil war was stirred up, before the country was plunged into disaster?
I think only a person enamored of dictatorship and brutality could argue that it was better before Saddam Hussein.
So the Iraqis who say that life was actually better before the invasion are enamored of dictatorship?
I think
surprised to hear that.
I think that's the lesson you draw, because the consequence of the overthrow of Saddam was the unleashing of decades-old, some would say centuries-old, tensions among the components of what is now the nation-state of Iraq. That was not inevitable. It was caused by factors, I think, in substantial part outside of our control, the attraction to Iraq of al-Qaeda. I think it could have been handled better and at a lower human cost. But I think complaining about what's happened in Iraq is like complaining that the American response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor increased the level of violence in the Pacific region. When you face a threat to your basic national security, you have to take action. And that action can be extraordinarily painful and costly. But that doesn't say that the initial reaction was in any sense incorrect.
We have to ask whether or not Iran represents an existential threat to the United States that justifies the kind of action you've called for.
The President was very careful in the 2003 State of the Union message to say that some have argued that we must show Saddam was an imminent threat. But since when have dictators and terrorists ever given advance notice of their intention? The regime itself was the threat. That's why the regime had to be taken down as it was. Others argued the imminent threat point and said, since you haven't shown imminent threat, there's no justification for military action. That was wrong when they made the argument. It remains wrong today.
So do you make that same argument about the regime in Iran?
You know, I think that the situation in Iran is very different. But the argument about the threat that an Iran with nuclear weapons poses is a very real one. It does not rely on intelligence. It can be explained.
Which is not the situation today, but even by your own account.
I think all you have to do is look at the publicly available reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and there you find no sensible explanation for Iran's conduct other than that it is pursuing nuclear weapons.
You know that there's a lot of talk right now. Seymour Hersh and others have been reporting that there's been a massive increase in covert operations on the part of the United States within Iran, a presidential finding authorizing hundreds of millions of dollars in new clandestine activities. Do you think this is a good thing?
I don't read a lot of fiction. You know, I don't have a lot of time for that.
So you don't believe the United States is seeking regime change in Iran by supporting dissident groups and
I wish
others?
we were.
There's no evidence, in your view, that the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, for instance, or other groups that are oppose the regime in Iran have been funded and continue to be funded by the United States.
If you have evidence that the MEK, which is still listed in the United States as a terrorist group, is receiving U.S. funding, put it out on the record. I'd like to see it. I don't think it's happening.
Covert operations are a little hard to prove.
Well,
Wouldn't
then why are you talking about them? In other words,
I'm not talking about them alone. I mean,
if you think there's evidence that we're funding a terrorist group, then let's have it out. But citing Seymour Hersh is like citing the Easter Bunny.
We've got to take a break, but we'll be back with more of my conversation with John Bolton in a minute.